May God enlighten the eyes of our hearts to know the hope to which Christ has called us. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. So today's gospel tells the story of a poor widow who quietly and without fanfare puts her last penny into the offering plate, unnoticed by all except Jesus, who never fails to notice these small acts of love and grace. We could each probably take something different from this story. It's a story about how God pays attention to the small kindnesses that we offer, about how it's better to be rich in faith and poor in material wealth than it is to possess the world, but be stingy in love. But it's important when we're reading the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark, to pay attention to where the writer puts the story in the larger narrative that they're weaving. Mark often puts together stories and events that perhaps in real time didn't actually take place right alongside each other. And he does this to make sure we don't miss the particular thing that he's trying to draw our attention to, the real heart and focus of the story. And so, like many others, this story in Mark isn't a standalone. It's one of those paired readings that we come across a lot in this gospel. It follows right on the heels of a very different interaction that we heard this morning too, in which Jesus sits down to watch the temple's high and mighty strutting their stuff for all to see. I confess it's a little uncomfortable as a priest to be preaching on this text. Beware the scribes, Jesus says, who wear long robes, say long prayers, and sit in the best seats at church. Oh, it's awkward. But joking aside, this is sage advice. This whole chapter in Mark has Jesus running up against the scribes, the religious leaders, and the political honchos. These are your movers and shakers, the ones who hold all the cards in first century Israel. And these people are always trying to push Jesus into a corner. Jesus spends most of this chapter in Mark rolling his eyes at them, because they're all a little suspicious of Jesus and the upside-down kingdom that he's been preaching. And so they grill him with all their best lines of questioning. They ask him about taxes, about marriage, about law and order. You know, all those kinds of things that come up when you're trying to work out where someone stands on the hot potato issues. Now, Jesus won't play the game, and eventually he's fed up with them and sits down and tells his disciples, watch out for these guys. That's the context, the background against which Mark gives us this incredible contrast. A scene that is so utterly opposite to the one we've been watching unfold with the religious leaders. Because while the religious leaders flaunt their credentials for the admiring crowds, Jesus spots something that nobody else sees and invites the disciples to pay attention to it. An impoverished widow, quietly and faithfully giving the last and the little that she has in service of God. Beware the high and mighty, Jesus says, but pay attention to the small stuff. This week, I suspect a lot of you, like me, have been a little bit too glued to your TV screens, tablets, smartphones, caught up in the big stuff of politics and elections and the shifting currents of power in the world. Don't worry, I know better than to bring politics into the pulpit, but it does feel like maybe today's gospel has something to say to the time we live in, doesn't it? The big stuff of world events and breaking news stories, they have an amazing ability to draw our attention away from the stuff that's right in front of us, don't they? Often this week I found myself idly picking up my phone and refreshing my news app without even much realizing that I'm doing it. In fact, I have to confess that this sermon was a hard one to write. I just found myself too much distracted, too drawn away into other things that can feel like they're urgent and demand my anxiety and worry, but actually are far away. Things about which little old me can do exactly nothing. But then I came back to today's gospel, and as I sat with it a while longer, I found some solidarity here alongside the disciples. Like me, they find themselves distracted by the big stuff of power struggles and politics and the top dogs vying for the top spot. while Jesus busies himself with the immediate and the local, with the unnoticed. It's a strange contrast that we always have to live in, isn't it? Our own priorities and worries and relationships, the small patch of world that we inhabit every day, against the backdrop of the big stuff that is always vying for our attention. I think that feeling of contrast, contradiction even, of having to balance attention to one's little life alongside the big stuff of history that's unfolding, that's a contrast that the disciples are very familiar with. In this story, Jesus has finally arrived in Jerusalem, and within a couple of days, he's going to be handed over to the authorities to be tried and executed as an enemy of the state. The disciples, ever slow on the uptake, don't really understand this just yet. But soon enough, they'll find their entire lives disrupted and upended. And it begins right here, where Jesus gathers the disciples to the center of power and privilege in Israel, the temple. And with them, he watches the movers and shakers move and shake. But instead, Jesus says to them, pay attention not to these guys, but to this poor widow over here. Jesus spends a lot of time in the Gospels inviting people to pay attention. And usually what he's drawing attention to is the stuff that people pretty much ignore entirely. Consider the lilies, he says. Contemplate the sparrows. Take time to watch the wind. Jesus' sage advice seems to be something like this. Pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Beware of what is claiming your awareness. So when Mark gives us this strange contradiction of scenes, when he paints a picture of this startling contrast between the big stuff of politics and power and a quiet, faithful act of love and service, he's inviting us to consider just what has our attention and what might distract it. Jesus calls the disciples to see this widow. This is the stuff that isn't seen, because it isn't making ripples in the world. But this quiet act of love demands attention, Jesus says. Many of you will know that Emily and I recently welcomed our second daughter, Bronwyn, into the world, and we've been showered with so much love and support from this community. It's been staggering. And I've been struck again these last couple of weeks by that stark and strange contrast, almost a contradiction in terms, that as I find myself wearied by the world, and at times feel powerless, paralyzed even, somehow I'm yet sustained by the small acts of love and kindness right in front of me that make a difference. I think this is the reason that we have to pay attention to what we're paying attention to. Because the things that we focus and dwell on, the things that claim our imagination, these shape how we see the world. They determine what we think is important and what isn't. They shape the kinds of people that we admire and celebrate. And in turn, they shape the kinds of people that we become. I think Jesus is inviting the disciples to pay attention to what's populating their field of vision. What are they really focusing on? And how is that shaping their way of being in the world? What about us? What has our attention? What is claiming our anxiety and worry? And is it distracting us from the more immediate things right in front of us? When I open up my phone again and again to check the breaking news I might have missed in the last 5 minutes, what is on the other side of the screen, asking for my attention? Mark gives us this stark contrast and contradiction. The political movers and shakers vying for the crowd's attention, and a poor widow, totally unheeded, quietly giving more of herself in love than any of the others. There's a lesson for us here. Beware the ones who make a lot of noise, and instead follow the quiet acts of love, faith, and sacrifice that change the world. And it all starts with practicing the art of attention. Thanks be to God.